Welcome back, disciples. I hope your time spent with Augustine and the pantry incident was helpful. I hope you didn't get completely lost in his web of thoughts and second thoughts and side thoughts and higher thoughts. The one chapter I deleted for you, chapter 7, was an interruption in Augustine's dissection of his sin, to give praise to God, much like in the 5 prayers you read the week before. I didn't want to overload you all. And as a reminder, especially if some of you chose to share the memory of sin or vice from your own adolescence that you reconsidered in light of Augustine's example, Commandment 10 of small groups is keep it within the group. We've all got to be able to trust each other to keep confidences. So let's move on now to a deeper look at the social context and the first 16 years or so of the life of Augustine of Hippo. First of all, he wasn't from Hippo as his birthplace. Hippo Regius, in what is now Algeria, was the town where he was chosen to be ordained a priest and finally elevated to bishop, where he stayed until he died and where he did just about all of the saintly work he did. He was born in Tagaste, also in Algeria, about 45 miles south of Hippo. And as a side note, the name Hippo Regius has nothing to do with hippopotamuses. It's a mixture of Latin and the old Punic language, and it means the harbor with a palace, to distinguish it from another hippo that was the harbor with the canal. So the first thing we should notice about Augustine is that he isn't a European. He's a North African. His father Patricius had a Latin name and gave his son one too, and it's very possible that the dad came from an established Roman family. But Monica, his mother, was almost certainly a Berber, a native North African. The part of Algeria they lived in had once been part of the great kingdom Numidia, and before that the even greater empire of Carthage, the one with Hannibal and the elephants and the Punic Wars with Rome. At this stage of Augustine's life story, I don't want to push this point too far. Numidia had been part of the Roman Empire for over 400 years by the time Augustine was born, and we know he received a standard Latin Roman education. But we also know he was bilingual. And this was a major factor in why he became a bishop at the relatively young age of 41. And if we're imagining his skin color, we shouldn't be imagining a Northern Italian. When Augustine was born, on November 13th, 354, Christianity had been legal in the Roman Empire for just over 40 years. In 313, as part of a truce between two Roman emperors who weren't in the mood to keep warring for sole command over the empire, they agreed to declare Christianity a legal religion, to call off all persecutions, and to restore or replace to Christian houses of worship any and all items that had been confiscated. One of those two emperors was the famous Constantine, the first emperor to convert to Christianity. By 354, Constantine had been long dead, and his son Constantius was the sole emperor, and also a Christian. Christianity wouldn't become the official imperial religion until the reign of Theodosius I, when Augustine was in his 30s. But Christianity had acquired plenty of cultural normalcy, and it would not have been a hindrance to his advancement in local society that his mother Monica was a devout Christian. And this is even more true for North Africa than for other parts of the empire. The whole southern Mediterranean coast, from Egypt all the way west to the edges of Morocco, had established, settled Christian communities well before any other region except the Holy Land and maybe Western Turkey. A few examples. In the year 250, many Christian communities, even in the oldest mission fields of Iraq and Jordan, were still meeting in house churches. France's Christian population had come and gone and was only just being reestablished. Milan and Turin and Florence and the other great northern Italian cities have no archaeological footprint of Christian churches for nearly another 100 years. Egyptian and Algerian sites from the 200s have established church buildings with extensive mosaic remnants. Every moderate-sized town had its own bishop and priest assistants. Alexandria in Egypt had developed a system of archbishop and auxiliary bishops. In the region of Carthage, bishops were already in the habit of meeting in synod twice a year, in a format that looked an awful lot like the Roman Senate. They had produced the first two Latin language theologians, Tertullian and Saint Cyprian. They had made not just records, but literary artifacts of martyrdom trials, including the famous diary of Saint Perpetua and her slave girl, Saint Felicity. They had their own charismatic movement, the Montanists. They were in more consistent communication with the Bishop of Rome than any other region, and frequently tried to align their religious policies. One of their own would end up the private tutor to Emperor Constantine's first son and presumed heir, Crispus. What I'm saying here is that North African Christianity was weird. It was weird in its strength, its structure, and its spirituality, in comparison to most other regions of the empire where Christianity had any presence at all. It was an expression of the age-old independent streak that characterized North African society in the ancient world as a whole. And that is no small part of the reason that the peoples of North Africa historically hated being under Roman control. As a bishop, Augustine was going to have to deal not only with internal schisms between institutional and charismatic flavors of Christianity, but also with freedom fighter and guerrilla warrior groups that sometimes co-opted the principles of Christian society for their terror attacks on Romans and other ethnic groups. In so many ways, Augustine's fellow Punic, Numidian, Berber, Roman compatriots were a spirited group. How much of all this went into Augustine's self-identity as a child and a teenager, we can't really say. In Confessions, he doesn't go into any of those issues. He stays on individualized topics, like how needy and grabby he was as a toddler, how much he hated school, not because it was a Roman school, but just because it got in the way of his playtime. How much better school got when he started reading the classics of Latin, epic, and rhetoric. Not Greek, though. He despised Greek. And, of course, all his patterns of sin. Augustine knew he was a bright kid. He kicked himself later in life for not applying that intelligence to productive things. Instead, he used it to lie to his parents and teachers, to sneak into circuses and theater shows, to cheat at sports, to steal from the family pantry. Between the ages of 11 and 15, Augustine was sent about 20 miles south of Tagaste to the renowned school at Madeira for his studies in literature and rhetoric. But then the family money ran short, and his father Patricius called him back home for a year while he saved up to send Augustine to upper school in the capital, Carthage. Augustine would later look at that as the biggest mistake his parents ever made. A shiftless, arrogant 15-year-old with no school or work commitments roaming the town with his ne'er-do-well friends in the throes of puberty? He never stood a chance. We'll spend more time on Augustine's sex life in a future video, and we will meet some of his friends who turned out to be decent people, I promise. Next week's session is meant to be a bit of a break from Augustine. Once a month, I've put a purely social event on the calendar, so we can get to know each other better without feeling tied to the context of the readings at hand. Your facilitator will help plan with you, whether you want to bring snacks and drinks to the church to share, or whether you'd prefer visiting at one of your homes or somewhere else in town. But your facilitator is still going to pass out the reading for the session 2 weeks from now. It will be longer than the pear tree reading, but also simpler and more straightforward. It's Augustine's writings and confessions about his mother, Monica. We'll get to know her through Augustine's own thoughtful and honest recollections. On the whole, it's a very admiring picture he draws of her. He sees her piety, her mysticism, her closeness to God. He recalls some of her own small vices, which he finds really charming and treats with great affection. And he openly questions some of the decisions she made about his upbringing, and how she might have formed him better as a Christian earlier on in his life. So it's not a hagiography of Monica at all. It's a balanced portrait. As you read, think about your own parents and the example of life they set for you, what they taught you both in words and by the way they behaved themselves in your home. If you were writing about them today, how would you assess the decisions they made, both by the standards of that moment in your past and by your growth in discipleship since then? Until then, enjoy your socials. See you in 2 weeks. Peace and all good.